Part one, 2 ways a scapegoat survivor keeps their narcissistic parent around. Is it still hard to be kind to yourself despite knowing you are not as bad as you were told you were as a child? Do you still feel blocked or scared when you try to do what you are good at? Do you wonder why it's so hard to feel safe in the world, even though you may no longer be in immediate danger? Well, adult scapegoat survivors of a narcissistic parent can find it very hard to see and treat themselves positively. How can experiences from childhood still be impacting me today? They may wonder. They may even conclude, well, there must be something wrong with me that I can't just get over it. Well, if this experience resonates with you, then today's video will explain why the effects of being a scapegoat child often last into adulthood. But the reason will not just be because things were really bad back then. There are 2 ways that adult scapegoat survivors carry their relationship with their narcissistic parent into the present. I'll describe these 2 ways in depth and use case examples to illustrate. This is also the first in a 2-part video series. In the second part, which will be posted next Friday, I'll explain how to psychologically leave the relationship to a narcissistic parent. Well, my name is Jay Reid, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in recovery from narcissistic abuse. In my professional and personal experience, I've worked to identify the fundamentals to the process of this kind of recovery. And this has led me to what I call the 3 pillars of recovery, which are pillar number 1, making sense of what happened so that you know it wasn't your fault. Pillar number 2, moving away from narcissistic abusers and towards safe people. And pillar number 3, living in defiance of the narcissist rules. They'll feel close to their internalized parent when they do what makes themselves happy. I think it's also essential to find and participate in communities of people who can get, validate, and support you on this path. I've seen and experienced large improvements in quality of life after putting these pillars into action. I also want to mention that I'm offering a new free ebook called 4 Ways to Heal for Adult Scapegoat Survivors. And in it, I offer 4 strategies to reclaim your authentic self from the fake and painful scapegoat identity, learn and apply the science behind gaining distance from narcissistic abusers, know the secret to reducing social anxiety for scapegoat survivors, and how to accept yourself as the fallible and valuable person you are. You can find the link to the book in the description box below or by clicking here. And last, if you find this content helpful, then I would encourage you to subscribe to this channel. You can also follow me on Instagram and TikTok under @jreidtherapy or Facebook under Jreid Psychotherapy. The links are also in the description box below. Well, today's video is based on the theory and research of Dr. Lorna Smith Benjamin. The concepts I describe in this video are laid out in greater detail in her book. You can see the reference here, and the reference will also be in the description box below. Our early worlds are shaped by the people in it, for better or worse. The people who make up the child's world determine the emotional contours and possibilities that the child can experience. No one has a greater influence over the child than their parents. As a very small person in a very big world, a child needs a big person to depend on for food, protection, and love. The child's physical and emotional needs can initially only be met by their parent, so the young child is incentivized by survival to stay close to that parent. The parent's responses will largely determine what the child's life feels like. If the child's parent was responsive and available to them, then their world will seem friendly and providing. And if the child's parent was unresponsive and frightening, then the child's world will seem uncaring and dangerous. And a child cannot swap out the world they're in if they don't like it. Evolution tells them that it's more important to stay close to the parent they have because that yields the highest odds of survival. The child has to do this regardless of the quality of relationship the parent offers them. They're programmed to see their parent as the only one who can supply what they need. Meanwhile, the child is developing an internal map of who they are in relation to their parent. You could say that the child internalizes their parent. Next, the child populates this internal map with the behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that bring the child closer to their internalized parent. When the child engages in these actions, thinks these thoughts, and feels these feelings, they then are close to their internalized parent. When the child acts, thinks, or feels otherwise, they feel more distant from the internalized parent. The child pursues closeness to this internal parent, whether that makes the child feel good or bad. Closeness means being somebody to someone. Distance risks being nobody to no one. When closeness to a parent means suffering. Well, in a good enough upbringing, the child generally feels close to their parent. That closeness is not contingent on the child meeting the parent's emotional needs. The parent is content for the child to explore their own world and then come back to that parent for nurturance as the child needs it. This kind of stance towards them tells the child that their parent is there for them as needed. A child with this kind of history will have an easy time relating to their internalized parent. Their internalized parent, just like their actual parent, wants what is good for them. Scapegoat children of narcissistic parents have to manufacture a feeling of closeness. The child has no consistent actual experience of feeling safe with and cared about by this parent. They have been used instead to embody the worthlessness that the narcissistic parent feels in themselves yet cannot tolerate. So being close to their internalized narcissistic parent hurts. The child's internalized parent endorses the child feeling shame and despair, thinking thoughts of being undeserving and defective, and taking actions that are self-defeating. When the child engages in these experiences, they feel closer to their internalized parent. So feeling this kind of pain becomes self-reinforcing for the scapegoat child and later the adult survivor. 2 ways a scapegoat child stays close to their internalized narcissistic parent. Well, the scapegoat child and adult survivor can stay close to their internalized narcissistic parent by either treating themselves the way their parent treated them or living as if the narcissistic parent is still around and in charge. When scapegoat survivors treat themselves the way their narcissistic parent treated them, many scapegoat survivors live with intense self-criticism. Their narcissistic parent may have criticized and berated them in order to make them feel worthless. By criticizing themselves later in life, the survivor is treating themselves the way their narcissistic parent treated them. There's also often a hard-to-define quality that can make the survivor feel like they are doing what they are supposed to be doing when they attack or criticize themselves like this. That quality can be the closeness to the internalized narcissistic parent that these sorts of self-attacks create. Well, let's look at another anonymized composite case example to illustrate. Mike grew up with a narcissistic father who regularly attacked him for committing supposed offenses. And these offenses amounted to not being able to read his father's mind and do his bidding. When his father came home from work in the evenings, it was a matter of when, not if, he'd start yelling at Mike. Typically, the offense was around not doing something his father had supposedly asked him to do. Oftentimes, Mike couldn't recall his father asking him to do the chore, but that didn't seem to matter. Mike would have to sit through his father's tirade about how selfish, irresponsible, inconsiderate, and immature Mike supposedly was. Mike's father, though, also had qualities that Mike admired. His father could be funny when he wanted to be. He was charismatic to people outside the family, and he always seemed to know what to say or do. In contrast, Mike's mother did not have much of a presence in his life. She was quiet and avoided conflict, and she would not protect Mike from his father's abuse. Away from his father, Mike found himself intensely criticizing himself. And this came out particularly as he recalled his experience in walking down the hallways in high school. If he said hi to one of his peers, he would then afterwards repeat the interaction in his head. Mike would hear his own voice in the exchange that just happened in his mind and find it weak and embarrassing. Then he would feel disgust towards himself for saying hello in such a supposedly awkward way. And he'd then be filled with anger at himself and shame. And there was little to nothing Mike could do to reassure himself in such instances. The fact that his peer did not seem to find anything wrong with Mike's greeting just did not matter. Just as Mike's father's tirades towards him felt inevitable, so did Mike's criticism of himself. Mike would often wonder at his private self-condemnation in these moments. It seemed so at odds with how people outside of his family received him. He was generally well-liked and respected by these people. And nonetheless, what felt more true to him were these excoriating attacks that he launched at himself. These attacks were how Mike stayed close to his internalized narcissistic father. Given the lack of viable alternatives for attachment in his family, he had to find a way to do this. His father was the only game in town, so to speak, and Mike had to find a way to play it or play in that game. And this self-criticism did the trick. Since self-criticism can result in feeling closer to one's internalized narcissistic parent, it can be very hard to break this practice. It's often not something you can just argue yourself out of. Instead, the scapegoat survivor needs to find and cultivate new relationships as viable alternatives to the internalized narcissistic parent. And in next week's video, I'll explain how the 3 pillars of recovery can set you up to do this. When the scapegoat survivor lives as if the narcissistic parent is still around and in charge. There's another subtle but powerful way a scapegoat survivor can stay close to their internalized narcissistic parent. When the survivor complies with the belief that they are defective and or undeserving, they are living as though their narcissistic parent is still around and in charge. Living in this way returns the survivor to what it was like as a kid. As painful as this feels for the scapegoat survivor, it also creates a sense of closeness to the internalized narcissistic parent. When a scapegoat child or survivor shies away from their own strength, they are keeping close to the narcissistic parent in this manner. The world that the narcissistic parent was in charge of forbade the scapegoat child from knowing their strength. Thwarting your own capabilities is one way of keeping the narcissistic parent in charge today. And I want to emphasize that the scapegoat survivor or child doesn't consciously choose to keep the narcissistic parent around in this way. Rather, they are governed by the unconscious demand to stay close to their internalized narcissistic parent. Failing to do this could result in being nobody to no one. And until there is a viable alternative, survival requires the child and later the survivor to maintain this closeness to the internalized narcissistic parent. It provides an organizing function. And acting as though the parent is still around and in charge is a means to this end. Well, let's look at another fictionalized case example to illustrate. Noah grew up with a domineering and vindictive narcissistic mother. She thwarted his attempts to be his own person throughout childhood and adolescence. If he was more than 1 minute late coming home from a social engagement, she would scream at him for at least 10 minutes about his supposed disrespect for the household rules. He was on restriction or grounded more often than not throughout high school. Over time, he stopped forging friendships outside his home. He was too weary of the unwinnable battles he had to fight with her to be able to have a social life. His parents had divorced a while back, so Noah had no adult to intervene on his behalf. He then developed painful ideas that he was defective and unlikable to others. These beliefs deterred him from seeking connection outside his home, thereby sparing him further conflict with his mother. After college, Noah took a job at a policy research institute downtown. He initially found the role to be interesting and meaningful in its purpose. Around the same time, he started therapy because he felt like his life just wasn't working. He felt like he was under constant pressure to accomplish goals, and this created intense anxiety most of his waking life. In an early session, his therapist asked him about his upbringing, and Noah began talking about how his mother treated him for the first time in his life. Initially, he felt relieved to know that he was not as bad as she had claimed. As the therapy wore on and he began to share all the ways he was mistreated by her, the rest of his life started to suffer. He found it much harder to focus at work, and this led to delays in his ability to meet deadlines and got him reprimanded by his supervisors. He also retreated from his friends because he did not feel like he could be honest with them about what he was going through. He also stopped doing things that were healthy, like exercising and eating healthy food. Noah's therapist understood this digression in his life as a way of unconsciously staying close to his internalized narcissistic mother. By thwarting his professional and social success, he was acting as if she was still around and in charge. The players were different, but the script played out very similarly to his high school years. It took some time in therapy before Noah could find the therapeutic relationship to be a viable alternative to the one with his internalized narcissistic mother. His therapist's ongoing empathic support of him was critical in orchestrating this shift. Well, the 3 pillars of recovery can help you live as though you are the one who is now in charge. These 3 principles help scapegoat survivors understand how they are staying close to their internalized narcissistic parent, structure their lives in ways that do not reinforce this closeness, and find alternative relationships that let the survivor feel connected while living as though they are the ones who are now in charge. Just as it is difficult to stop the practice of self-criticism if it creates closeness to the internalized narcissistic parent, so it is with living as though the parent is in charge in this way. Viable relationship alternatives to that parent are needed before one can surrender this practice too. Well, in next week's video, I'll explain the healing process of moving from closeness to the internalized narcissistic parent to closeness to safe people in your life today, and in essence, leaving behind the internalized narcissistic parent. It's a multifaceted process that's captured by the 3 pillars of recovery, not just in theory, but in action. And I'll describe a resource in next week's video that helps you structure your life so that over time you can make this shift. And as always, I want to thank everyone for your continued support of and engagement with this channel and with each other, using it as a place in the comments section to share your own experiences, what from the videos works, what doesn't, your own observations or thoughts about these topics is just, like I say, incredible to read, and is very, very much appreciated and respected by me. So with that, I look forward to posting again next week. Take care.